The moment my sister's hands pressed hard against my shoulders and sent me tumbling down the narrow staircase, I felt a sharp jolt of pain explode through my ankle and shoulder. But it was not just my body that was injured. In that instant, something deep in my heart shifted. A line I had tolerated being crossed over and over was suddenly carved into stone. This was not just an accident. It was a choice she made one she could never take back, and it shattered what little trust I still had in my family. My name is Emily. I am 34 years old, and for as long as I can remember, I have been trying to keep peace in a home that only seemed to understand conflict. My parents raised me in a small town where appearances mattered more than the truth. My mother, Helen, had a way of controlling every situation so she could tell the story in a way that suited her. My father, Robert, was the quiet one, rarely speaking up even when things were obviously wrong. I was the youngest of two daughters. My sister Claire is 3 years older, and in my mother's eyes, she could do no wrong. It had always been that way. I learned early on that if there was a fight, it would be my fault. If Claire made a mistake, someone else would be blamed, and that someone was usually me. I managed to escape our family's gravitational pull for a while. I went to nursing school, built a career in pediatric care, and lived a quiet life away from their constant criticism. But life has a way of dragging you back to places you thought you had left behind. 3 years ago, I went through a painful divorce. My ex-husband moved out of state within weeks, leaving me with a rented apartment I could not afford alone. My mother encouraged me to come back closer to home, saying it would be good for me to have family around. She said Claire had moved to another city, so I thought it might be safe enough. I found a small rental a few streets away from my parents' house, and for a time it felt manageable. I worked long shifts at the hospital sometimes through the night, but at least I knew my parents were nearby if I needed help. That changed 6 months ago when Claire suddenly reappeared. She was pregnant, and my mother treated the news as if the sun had risen just for her. Every conversation became about Claire's pregnancy, every plan adjusted to fit her needs. I told myself that it was understandable. Pregnancy is hard, and she was family, but I did not expect the way old patterns would return so quickly and so brutally. Favors became demands. I was criticized for not dropping everything to drive her to a prenatal appointment when I had just worked 12 hours. I was told I was selfish for not staying overnight when she felt tired. Still, I bit my tongue and kept showing up, telling myself it was temporary. I did not realize the price I was paying until that afternoon. I had stopped by my parents' house to drop off some paperwork for my mother's insurance. Claire was there sitting on the couch with her feet up. She asked me to take her shopping for baby clothes. I told her I could not, that I had a night shift starting in just a few hours and needed to rest. Her face changed. Her voice rose. Accusations spilled out, old grievances mixed with new. She followed me toward the stairs as I headed to the spare room to drop the papers on my mother's desk. And then, without warning, her hands were on me, shoving me hard. My body twisted as I fell the steps, slamming into my side, my ankle turning painfully beneath me. The world tilted. By the time I landed on the floor below, Claire was standing at the top, her face pale, one hand on her belly. She said nothing to me, just gasped and called for my mother. I would learn later that she lost the baby that night. And I would also learn that in my family's eyes, that loss was my fault. It did not matter that she had pushed me. It did not matter that I had injuries of my own. The story had already been written by my mother, and in that version, I was the villain. Growing up in our family was like living under a constant cloud that never fully lifted. My earliest memories are of my mother's voice giving instructions, correcting me, telling me what I should say, how I should act, even how I should feel. My father worked long hours as an accountant, and when he was home, he mostly sat in his recliner watching television, speaking only when my mother asked him something directly. He avoided conflict the way some people avoid bad weather by staying inside until it passed. Claire. My older sister learned quickly that the way to survive was to align herself with our mother. She followed her everywhere, adopted her opinions, and echoed her judgments. If my mother liked something, Claire liked it too. If my mother disliked someone, Claire would make sure she disliked them as well. I was different. I wanted to figure out who I was without my mother's constant supervision, but that difference often came at a price. When I was a child, if Claire and I fought, my mother's verdict was almost always the same. "Emily, you need to apologize to your sister." It did not matter who started it or what had actually happened. By the time I reached high school, I knew I would need to create distance between myself and my family if I wanted to breathe freely. I studied hard, got good grades, and applied to nursing school in a city 3 hours away. I thought the distance would be enough to give me my own life. For a while, it worked. I built a routine that had nothing to do with them. I made friends who knew me as just Emily, not as Helen's younger daughter or Claire's little sister. I met Mark, the man who would become my husband, and for a time, we were happy. But marriage is not a guarantee of security, and over 12 years, small cracks turned into deep fractures. When the marriage ended, it was quick and clean on paper, but messy in every other way. Mark moved to another state, leaving me with a lease I could not afford and no safety net. My mother saw her chance to pull me back in. She called, sounding concerned, telling me it would be better if I lived closer so they could help me get back on my feet. She promised that Claire was living in another city now working and that I would have space to rebuild. Tired and overwhelmed, I agreed. I found a small duplex to rent just a few streets away from my parents' home. At first, it felt like I had made the right decision. I worked long shifts at the children's hospital and sometimes dropped by my parents' house to share dinner. I helped with yard work and took my mother to her medical appointments. Claire was still out of town, and I thought perhaps the old family tensions might never resurface. I underestimated how quickly old patterns return when given the slightest opportunity. About 6 months after I moved back, Claire reappeared. She had left her job, returned home, and announced she was pregnant. My mother's joy was immediate and unrestrained. She began rearranging her schedule around Claire's needs, attending every doctor's appointment, planning baby showers, and talking endlessly about the baby. My father smiled and nodded, but it was my mother who became the center of this new world built around Claire's pregnancy. I tried to be supportive. After all, pregnancy can be exhausting, and Claire did not have a partner in the picture. She told us the father was someone she had dated briefly, but they were no longer in contact. I offered rides when I could pick up groceries and listened when she wanted to talk. But slowly the balance shifted. Offers turned into expectations. If I said I was tired after a 12-hour shift, my mother would tell me that Claire's needs were more important. If I had plans on a weekend, I was told I was being selfish for not spending the time helping Claire get ready for the baby. At family dinners, every conversation turned to the pregnancy. My mother would beam as Claire described the nursery theme or showed baby clothes she had bought. I would sit quietly sometimes contributing, sometimes just watching. It was not jealousy. It was the creeping realization that I was becoming invisible again, just as I had been growing up. The few times I tried to talk about my own life, the conversation would shift back to Claire within minutes. I reminded myself that this was temporary, that once the baby came, things would settle. I told myself that enduring a few months of imbalance was worth keeping the peace. But deep down, the familiar weight was returning that heavy knowledge that in my family's story, I was not a main character. I was a supporting role at best and, at worst, the convenient scapegoat when things went wrong. That knowledge, though uncomfortable, was still something I thought I could manage. What I did not realize was that it was about to get much worse and much more personal in ways I could not have imagined. At first, the changes were small enough that I could pretend they were harmless. I would stop by my parents' house after a shift to check in, and I would find Claire on the couch with her feet propped up, my mother bustling around the kitchen, making her tea or cutting up fruit. That was fine. But then there were the little comments. If I mentioned being tired from work, my mother would say something like, "You should try carrying another life inside you before you complain." When Claire craved a certain meal, my mother would cancel plans. We had to cook it for her instead. One Saturday, I came over to help with yard work, only to be told that Claire needed me to drive her to a store across town because she had seen a particular crib she wanted. I reminded her I had agreed to help with the garden, but my mother waved her hand and said the garden could wait, the baby could not. It became clear that the hierarchy in the house was shifting in a way that left no space for me. Financial help was another sore point. My mother gave Claire money for baby supplies, paid her rent when she was short, and even covered her car insurance for 2 months without hesitation. When I needed to replace my washing machine and mentioned it over dinner, my mother told me to just use the laundromat for a while until I saved enough. It was not about the money. It was about what the money symbolized. One evening, I arrived with a small bouquet of flowers for my mother's birthday. She smiled politely, but then said, "You know, the best gift you could give me is to make me a grandmother again." Claire laughed and said, "Yeah, Emily, stop wasting time." I felt the sting of it, but chose to let it slide, not wanting to turn her birthday dinner into a fight. These moments added up like small cuts. Each one was easy to ignore in isolation, but together they formed a pattern that was all too familiar from our childhood. I began to notice how often my achievements went unnoticed, while Claire's smallest efforts were celebrated. When I received recognition at work for handling a complicated case, my mother changed the subject to Claire finding a good deal on a stroller. When I managed to fix the leaky faucet in my parents' kitchen, my father thanked me briefly before asking Claire if she needed help hanging the baby mobile. The imbalance was constant, and the unspoken rule was clear: everything revolved around Claire and the baby she was carrying. Claire herself began to push boundaries more openly. She would call me at work asking for rides, knowing full well I could not leave in the middle of a shift. If I said no, she would complain to my mother, and I would receive a lecture later about how I was not being supportive enough. She started making digs about my single status, saying things like, "Maybe if you had a family of your own, you would understand," or joking that I was married to my job. These jabs were delivered with a smile, but the intent was sharp. I tried to focus on my work and my own home life, but the gravitational pull of my family's dynamic was hard to escape when I lived so close. Every week seemed to bring a new reminder that my place was secondary. My father remained mostly silent, but his silence spoke volumes. He never contradicted my mother, never suggested that perhaps I deserved the same consideration as Claire. On the rare occasions when I stayed away for a few days, my mother would call asking why I was being distant, yet she never asked how I was doing. The turning point in this slow escalation came at a Sunday dinner in early spring. I had brought over a homemade dessert, a lemon tart I knew my mother liked. As we were serving it, Claire sighed and said it was too tart for her taste. My mother immediately took her plate away and offered to make her a grilled cheese instead. Claire smirked at me as if she had won something. I sat there smiling tightly, telling myself again that it was temporary, that I could endure it until the baby was born. But part of me was beginning to question why I was always the one enduring, why my comfort was always the first thing sacrificed. That night, lying in bed, I thought about the years I had spent away from this environment, how light I had felt, not having to compete for space in my own family. I realized I had been letting myself believe that coming back would be different this time. It was not different. It was the same story with a new chapter, and I was playing the same role I had promised myself I would never play again. I did not yet know that the chapter ahead would be far worse than anything before, and that before long I would be forced to choose between staying in this role forever or finally walking away for good. The following weeks were like watching storm clouds gather, darkening a sky you had hoped would stay clear. Claire began to make her demands more public, often in front of our mother, so that refusal would seem heartless. One Friday evening, I arrived at my parents' house after work because my mother had asked me to help prepare for a family dinner. Claire was in the living room scrolling through her phone. Without looking up, she said, "Emily, can you go pick up some things for me from the baby store?" I told her I needed to finish helping in the kitchen first. She glanced at my mother and said, "See what I mean? She never puts family first." My mother didn't defend me. She just frowned and told me I should hurry. Another time, I came by to drop off some documents for my father, and Claire asked if I could stop by the pharmacy to get her prenatal vitamins. I explained I was already late for meeting a friend, and she muttered loudly, "Must be nice to have such a selfish life." When I confronted her later about these comments, she rolled her eyes and said I was too sensitive. Public humiliation became her new weapon. At a Sunday dinner with several extended family members present, she told a story about how I had forgotten to bring her a snack when she was feeling faint during a shopping trip. She embellished the story, painting me as someone who couldn't be bothered to care for her pregnant sister. My mother laughed along, adding that I had always been too focused on myself. I sat there smiling tightly, my cheeks burning, feeling the familiar weight of being cast as the ungrateful younger sister. The comments weren't limited to me. She also began making remarks about my career. One evening, when I mentioned how exhausting my 12-hour shifts had been, she smirked and said, "Well, maybe if you had a real family, you'd understand what real work is." My mother chuckled like it was just a joke, but I knew she believed it. The imbalance at home grew sharper. My mother would cancel plans with me at the last minute if Claire wanted to do something. If I offered to take my parents out to dinner, she would suggest we invite Claire, and if Claire declined, the outing would be canceled. Claire began leaving her laundry at my house because, as she put it, I didn't have enough going on, and she needed the help. When I refused one week because I was busy, she told my mother I had snapped at her, and my mother called to lecture me about kindness and family duty. There was a night when things nearly came to a boiling point. My parents had invited a few neighbors over for dinner, and as we sat around the table, Claire started complaining about how hard it was to get ready for the baby with so little support. She listed all the things she wished she had help with: painting the nursery, assembling furniture, organizing clothes, and then she looked straight at me and said, "But Emily's always too busy for her family." The table went quiet. My mother broke the silence with, "Well, she's been like that since she was a teenager, always off doing her own thing." I felt the heat rise in my face. Every muscle in my body told me to stand up and walk out, but I stayed seated, forcing myself to finish the meal. That night, I lay awake replaying the words in my mind, wondering how many people believed them. It wasn't just that Claire wanted help. It was the way she wanted me to be seen as failing. Every time she publicly accused me of selfishness, my mother reinforced it, and my father stayed silent. These weren't just casual digs, they were shaping the narrative of who I was in the eyes of everyone around us. I had been here before as a child, but as an adult, I had believed I could manage it. The truth was, it was managing me. There was another dinner, this one, just the immediate family, when Claire told my mother she was thinking of naming the baby after our grandmother. My mother's eyes lit up, and she told her how proud she was. Then she turned to me and said, "It's a shame you never thought to carry on the family name, but I guess that's not your priority." Claire smirked over her water glass, and I felt the sting of being diminished again. I realized these moments were chipping away at more than just my patience. They were eroding my sense of belonging. I could feel something inside me beginning to shift, a slow, steady change from hurt to resolve. I didn't know it yet, but the breaking point was approaching, and when it came, it would not be in whispered accusations or small humiliations. It would be in the form of a shove that sent me not just down the stairs, but out of the role I had been forced to play my entire life. It happened on a warm afternoon in early summer, the kind of day that should have felt easy and calm. I had finished a long morning at the hospital, my back aching from hours on my feet, and stopped by my parents' house to drop off some paperwork my mother needed for her insurance renewal. When I stepped inside, the familiar smell of lemon cleaner and my mother's perfume met me. Claire was sitting on the couch with her feet up a throw blanket over her lap, even though it was nearly 80 degrees outside. She looked up from her phone and immediately said, "Good. You're here. I need you to take me to the mall." I told her I couldn't. I had a night shift starting in a few hours and needed to get home to rest. Her expression shifted instantly from neutral to annoyed. "You always have some excuse," she said, her voice rising a notch. I reminded her calmly that I had been working since 6 that morning and still had to work overnight. She rolled her eyes and said it must be nice to have a job where you can just leave whenever you feel like it. I started walking toward the spare room to leave the paperwork on my mother's desk. Claire followed her words, turning sharper with every step. "You've never been there for me, not when we were kids, not now. You think you're better than me just because you have a job and some apartment." My heart was pounding not from fear, but from the familiarity of this script. I told her I didn't want to argue and kept moving toward the stairs that led up to the room where my mother kept her files. She was right behind me, her voice almost a hiss now. "You're pathetic, Emily. No wonder you're alone." I had one foot on the bottom step when I felt both her hands slam into my shoulders. The force was unexpected violent, and my body pitched forward. My ankle twisted on the second step, and my shoulder slammed hard against the wall as I tumbled upward before gravity pulled me back. My legs folded awkwardly beneath me as I fell backward down the stairs, the edge of each step jarring against my hip and back until I landed hard on the floor below. For a moment, everything was soundless except for the rush of my own breathing. Pain shot up from my ankle and my shoulder throbbed. I looked up to see Claire at the top of the stairs, her face pale, one hand clutching her belly. Her mouth opened like she might say something, but instead she gasped and called for my mother. Within minutes, my mother appeared, taking in the scene in a single glance. She went straight to Claire, asking if she was okay, guiding her to the couch. I sat on the floor, trying to process what had just happened, my ankle swelling by the second. Claire was complaining of cramping, her voice trembling. My mother didn't look at me when she said, "Go home, Emily, we'll take care of this." That night, Claire was taken to the hospital. I wasn't told until the next day that she had lost the baby. My mother called her tone icy and told me she didn't want to see me at the house for a while. She said I had upset Claire so badly that it had caused the miscarriage. I tried to explain that she had pushed me, that I had been the one injured, but my mother cut me off. "Don't make this about you, Emily. You need to think about the damage you've done." The weight of her words settled over me like a heavy blanket, suffocating and cold. In that moment, I understood that no matter what had actually happened, the story had already been written without me. In their version, I was the villain. My father didn't call. Claire didn't speak to me. The silence from them was almost worse than the accusations. At work, I went through the motions tending to my patients, while my mind replayed the fall over and over, each detail burned into my memory. It wasn't just the physical pain that lingered, it was the realization that I had been one shove away from something far worse. And still, in my mother's eyes, I was the one to blame. That was the moment something inside me shifted for good. I could no longer convince myself this was temporary or that things would improve after the baby was born. The baby was gone, and somehow I had become the scapegoat for a tragedy I had not caused. I knew then that if I stayed, it would destroy me piece by piece, and no one in that house would care. That knowledge was like a spark in the dark, small but impossible to ignore. It was the beginning of the end of the role I had been playing my entire life. In the days after the fall, I moved through my life in a haze of pain, both physical and emotional. My ankle was wrapped in a brace, and my shoulder ached whenever I lifted my arm, but the worst injury was invisible. It was the fracture of whatever fragile bond I had still believed existed between me and my family. My mother's calls were brief and cold, centered only on Claire's recovery and the arrangements for what she referred to as a period of rest. I was not invited to be part of it. I did not see my father at all. Friends from work noticed something was wrong. A fellow nurse named Sandra caught me staring into space during a quiet moment on the floor and asked if I was okay. The words spilled out before I could stop them, the shove, the fall, the way my mother blamed me for the loss of the baby. She listened without interrupting, then said something that lodged itself deep in my mind. "You cannot heal in the place that keeps hurting you." I went home that night and sat in the dim light of my kitchen, her words echoing in my head. For years, I had told myself I could manage the way my family treated me, that I was strong enough to endure it. But now I realized endurance was not the same as survival, and survival was not the same as living. If I stayed, it would only be a matter of time before another shove came, whether literal or metaphorical. I needed to leave. The idea was terrifying. My entire life had been built in the shadow of my family, even when I had lived away from them. The thought of cutting that tether completely made my chest tighten, but the thought of staying made it hard to breathe at all. I began making a plan quietly, almost ritualistically. I went through my apartment and began sorting my belongings into what I wanted to keep, what I could sell, and what I could donate. I opened a separate savings account and started depositing any extra money from overtime shifts into it. I didn't tell anyone except Sandra, who promised to help if I needed it. I also began looking at job postings in other hospitals. One listing caught my eye, a position at a large medical center in a city about an hour away. The salary was higher, the hours more predictable, and the benefits were excellent. I applied without telling my family. While I waited to hear back, I researched housing in that area. Most places were out of my price range, but I found a few small apartments that I could afford if I was careful. I pictured myself in one of them, coming home from work without the weight of my mother's expectations or Claire's demands pressing on me. The more I imagined it, the more real it felt. Weeks passed with no word from my family beyond a terse text from my mother saying Claire was doing better. Then the call came from the medical center offering me the job. I accepted immediately, my heart pounding with a mixture of relief and fear. I gave my landlord notice and began the process of securing a new apartment in the city. Still, I said nothing to my family. I wanted to control the timing of my departure to leave on my own terms. My plan was to tell them once everything was signed and certain. I thought I had more time that I could prepare myself for whatever storm would come when I told them. But life in that house had a way of accelerating toward disaster, and the storm found me before I was ready. On a humid evening in late July, I was invited to dinner at my parents' house. Part of me wanted to decline, but I thought perhaps enough time had passed since the fall to allow for civility. I was wrong. The meal had barely begun when Claire made a comment about how I still hadn't apologized for what had happened. My mother nodded in agreement, saying an apology was the least I could do. I felt the air in the room thicken. I put down my fork, looked at both of them, and said calmly, "I am not apologizing for something I did not do." My father cleared his throat, but said nothing. Claire leaned back in her chair, smirking. "You'll never admit you're wrong, will you?" she said. That was the moment I knew there was no point in waiting for the perfect time to leave. There would never be a perfect time, only the moment I decided my future mattered more than their approval. That night when I got home, I called the apartment manager in the city and confirmed my move-in date. I spent the next few days packing boxes in secret, my determination hardening with every taped seam. The decision was no longer terrifying. It was necessary. I was done waiting for permission to save myself. The final break came faster than I had expected. I had planned to leave in 2 weeks when my new apartment would be ready, but one evening after another tense dinner at my parents' house, I realized I could not stay another day. The conversation had started innocently enough with my mother asking about my work schedule, but quickly turned into Claire complaining that I had not been available to help her with errands. She said it with a tone that implied my absence was an act of betrayal, and my mother backed her up, saying I had been cold and ungrateful ever since the incident. I sat there in silence, feeling that familiar heat rising in my chest, until I heard Claire say that maybe if I learned to be part of a family, I wouldn't end up alone. Something in me snapped, not in a loud or chaotic way, but with a quiet certainty. I set my fork down and said, "I am done." My mother blinked as if she hadn't heard me. Done with what she asked. "Done with this," I said, gesturing to the table, the room, the whole history of it. Done being blamed for things I didn't do. Done being treated like I don't matter. Claire laughed under her breath, but I didn't even look at her. I stood up, walked to the hallway where I had left my bag, and slung it over my shoulder. My father started to say something, but stopped when I turned to face him. "I'll come by for my things in the morning," I said. "Tonight I'm leaving." My mother's voice followed me out the door, sharp and incredulous, but I didn't look back. I drove straight to Sandra's house, and when she opened the door, she didn't ask questions. She just stepped aside and let me in. That night, I slept in her guest room, my suitcase at the foot of the bed, feeling more peace than I had in months. The next day, I returned to my parents' house with Sandra and a few boxes. Claire wasn't there, but my mother hovered in the doorway as I packed. "You're overreacting," she said. "You'll regret this." I kept my back to her, folding clothes, boxing up dishes, choosing silence over the fight she wanted. Sandra helped me load everything into her car, and when we drove away, I didn't glance in the rearview mirror. Over the next week, I settled into my new apartment in the city. It was small, just one bedroom and a living room that doubled as a dining space, but it was mine. I arranged my furniture the way I wanted, filled the kitchen with food I liked, and hung pictures without anyone telling me they were crooked. The job at the medical center started the following Monday, and I was greeted by a team that valued my skills and respected my time. The difference was immediate. I wasn't coming home drained from battles I hadn't chosen to fight. I had energy to cook, to read, to explore the neighborhood. I even signed up for an evening art class, something I had loved in high school but abandoned when my family dismissed it as a waste of time. Weeks passed, and the distance from my family felt like oxygen. There were still calls from my mother, sometimes sharp, sometimes syrupy, each one probing for a way back into my daily life. I kept the conversations short, offering no openings for guilt or obligation. Claire didn't call at all, which was fine by me. My father sent a brief text once asking if I was doing okay. I replied that I was, and left it at that. At work, I was thriving, taking on challenging cases, and earning the respect of my colleagues. My supervisor mentioned the possibility of moving into a senior role within the year, something I wouldn't have had the bandwidth to consider before. Financially, I was stable, even saving a little each month, and emotionally, I was lighter. The first weekend of autumn, I invited a few coworkers and neighbors over for coffee and pastries. As I stood in my kitchen pouring mugs and hearing laughter fill the space, I realized this was what home was supposed to feel like. No one was competing for attention. No one was tearing anyone down. There was only warmth, the kind that comes from being surrounded by people who want you to do well. One of my neighbors asked if I had family nearby, and I smiled, saying only that I had some, but we weren't close. I didn't feel the need to explain further. My story wasn't defined by them anymore. I went to bed that night in my quiet apartment, the city lights glowing faintly through the blinds, and for the first time in years, I felt completely safe. Not just from physical harm, but from the constant erosion of my confidence and self-worth. I had stepped out of the shadow of my family's control, and in doing so, I had stepped into my own life. A year later, the life I had built felt solid under my feet. The city that had once seemed overwhelming now felt like home, its streets familiar and its rhythms steady. My small apartment had become a haven filled with plants, books, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing every inch of it was mine alone. The promotion my supervisor had hinted at came through 6 months after I started bringing a higher salary and more predictable hours. With the raise and the savings I had built, I began to look for something I had once thought impossible a place to buy. I found it in a quiet neighborhood not far from the hospital, a modest, single-story house with a small garden out front and enough sunlight in the living room to warm the space even in winter. Standing in that empty house on the day I got the keys, I thought about all the places I had lived before and how none of them had truly been mine. This one was different. This one was proof that I could not only survive on my own, but thrive. The news of my purchase spread quickly through the extended family. I knew because within 2 weeks, my mother called, her voice cautious but curious. "I heard you bought a house," she said, almost as if testing the words. I told her it was true, and after a pause, she asked if she and Claire could come see it. Part of me wanted to refuse, but another part recognized that I no longer feared their judgment. They could come and see, and it would not change what I had built. When they arrived, Claire's eyes swept over the living room, the kitchen, the artwork I had hung on the walls. She didn't say much, but I caught the flicker of surprise in her face. My mother commented on how nice the place was, then quickly shifted to telling me about some difficulty Claire was having with her job search. I listened politely without offering solutions. That was the difference now. I didn't step in to fix things for them. I didn't make their problems my own. Over time, the visits became occasional, and while my mother still tried to push boundaries, I kept them firm. She learned slowly that access to my life was conditional on respect. The real revenge, if it could be called that, was not in any single achievement, but in the steady accumulation of them. Each success, I had a thriving career, a beautiful home. Friendships that nurtured me was a quiet rebuke to every time they had said I couldn't manage without them. They had expected me to crumble when I left to come back humbled and dependent. Instead, I had flourished. The garden in front of my house became a kind of metaphor for that growth. I planted flowers in colors that made me happy, tended them in the early mornings before work, and watched them spread. Neighbors would stop to compliment them, and I would smile knowing they were another piece of this life I had chosen for myself. In late spring, I hosted a housewarming party for friends and colleagues. The laughter and conversation spilled out onto the back patio, and I stood there with a glass of wine taking it all in. This was the kind of family I had wanted all along, not bound by blood, but by mutual care and respect. As the sun set and the lights I had strung across the yard began to glow, I thought about the woman I had been 2 years ago sitting in her kitchen afraid to make a move. That woman had believed she needed to wait for the right time for permission for something to change on its own. Now I knew the truth. The right time was the moment you decided you deserved better. Claire still rarely called, and when she did, it was brief. I no longer felt the pull to mend what had been broken between us. Some things could not be repaired, and that was okay. My mother's calls were more measured, her comments less cutting, though the old habits never disappeared entirely. But I had changed, and that change meant their approval or disapproval no longer had the power to shape my choices. One evening, sitting in my living room with the windows open to the sound of summer crickets, I realized I no longer thought about the fall down the stairs with anger. It was still a painful memory, but it had become the turning point that led me here. Without that moment, I might have stayed shrinking myself to fit into a space that was never meant for me. Instead, I had stepped out, built something of my own, and proved to them, to myself, that I could. As I locked up the house that night, turning off lights one by one, I felt a deep sense of closure. The cycle of control that had defined so much of my life was broken. In its place was a life I had chosen full of peace, purpose, and the quiet, undeniable power of standing on my own.